to talk to you tonight about your two novels, Damascus Station and also Moscow X. And normally I start the authors off with some easy questions, but I already warned you, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to just jump right in because you joined the CIA when you were 19. You were recruited, right?
That's right. Yes, I was an undergrad. It was like the tail end of my freshman year. I was at a small school outside of Chicago, and the guy at the time who ran the Middle East analytics shop at the CIA came to recruit on campus. And at that point, most of my experience in high school working had been digging holes for a sprinkler system company and working as a cashier at Wendy's. No joke. And I thought the CIA would be kind of a nice step up from that. So I threw my name in, thought, nothing will happen. And, here I am. I went through the whole process really young and early, and did a couple summers as an intern there, and then joined full time after I graduated.
Well, after being an intern at the CIA, how did that change your experience going through school? Because I'm guessing they're recruiting you so early so that you're not getting in trouble and having to fail any type of security checks, right?
That is a big part of it. I like to think that I was, on a very up and up trajectory and would have been, an upstanding citizen regardless. But they do attempt to get, and it's not for any nefarious purpose, but it's just a very practical, realistic perspective, which is if you can get people in the pipeline in their freshman or sophomore year, it makes it much more likely, two things. One, makes it much more likely they can actually pass polygraphs to get in. And then number two, you get 2 summers. If you're the CIA, you get 2 summers to look at somebody and to see how do they do the job. Are they effective at the work? And really that works both ways. I got a couple summers to test out the CIA too. So I think it's really a pretty effective program. And I know it's still out there. I think, the CIA recruits people off of university campuses freshman and sophomore year all over the country.
And you studied international studies, right?
Yeah, international relations and French. That's right. That's right.
And a big impact and helpful when you were then a full-time analyst at the CIA?
I wish I could say yes. I mean, it's one of those things where the school is probably it's not that it's not important or not effective, but as soon as you get in, you kind of realize the job is very different. I mean, it's not an academic job, it's analytic writing, briefing. I mean, if you're a case officer or in some other role, it's totally different from school. But the international relations study did prepare me to kind of, it reflected the interest that I had in the world, the desire to understand how the world really works. And, I think in that respect was a helpful kind of primer for the work at CIA.
And I think more and more that usually is the case with some of the college degrees. It's like you need to go through this. It's the stepping stone to get you to the career that you want. But in reality, you're probably not going to use the majority of the stuff that you studied in school. I know I don't with my engineering degree.
That's right. I think it's maybe a signaling mechanism more than anything, especially when you're talking about a liberal arts education like that. I mean, I wasn't in some kind of hardcore engineering program or something like that. But the CIA, for good or for ill, does a lot of recruiting out of programs like that with, relatively smart young people who are really highly motivated and really excited about doing this kind of work and interested in the world. It's a great sort of feeding ground for the agency, for sure.
Mm-hmm. And when you were in the agency, you focused on Syria and also did a stint in counterterrorism, right?
That's right. Yeah, I pretty much the whole time worked on Syria from different angles. And one of those, which you mentioned, was doing a rotation in what's called the CIA's Counterterrorism Center, focused on Syria and Iraq, which would have been, 2008, 2009, around that time period, back when, the Iraq War was very hot and counterterrorism issues related to Iraq and the Middle East were on everyone's radar.
And so what was that like? I mean, going from being a college student, small town USA essentially, to now being part of the CIA and working with such big worldwide issues that are happening and having to debrief all of the different policymakers?
It was really fun. I mean, I think I kind of had the attitude because I had joined relatively young, and it was really, again, like my first real job. I think I sort of had this perspective of I'm kind of really happy to be here and really excited for this opportunity. There were definitely times where I thought it seems insane that, I mean, when I got to Langley for the first time, I was 20, and I had the full security clearance, and I'd gone through the poly and the medical and the psych and all that kind of stuff. So I was fully cleared, but there were definitely periods of time, especially early on, where I kind of thought it seems a little crazy that someone this young is like and working on things that much older analysts are working on. And of course I was under, adult supervision the whole time. But I think as a young person, you kind of, and I think that's probably true in other occupations as well. You just kind of have this, maybe sometimes this feeling of like, I'm sort of been tossed in, and I can't believe that the grownups are letting me play in the game, so that definitely was a feeling that I felt a lot in those early years. But I was mostly just really happy to be there and really excited for the opportunity, and felt like it was one of those really cool things where I hadn't really tried to get it. I hadn't been scheming or gaming for this for a long time. It kind of just happened organically, and it's been just a tremendous blessing to me to have had that opportunity, so early in my life.
What was the biggest surprise for you? Because I think everyone's going into this with different levels of assumptions when you say, I'm going to be working for the CIA.
Yeah.
Not exactly James Bond all the time.
No, actually, not all the time. I would say I would sadly report that none of my days resembled Jack Ryan's or James Bond's days.
But Jack Ryan was an analyst. I mean, come on.
Oh, I know. He must have been in a different part of the CIA, because that I did not experience that so much. I do think, maybe it's sort of, I should have anticipated this, but I do think that kind of humdrum bureaucratic aspect of it, which now I find to be quite humorous and try to incorporate when I can into the novels, because there are pieces of it that are just so weird and quirky that they're entertaining to me, at least. I think seeing that it's just like a really big normal organization was kind of profoundly surprising to me to start, because at that age, I mean, I wasn't naive, but also my entire life up until the point I walked in, my mental model of the CIA was out of Hollywood, out of spy fiction. And so to just see that it's actually a really big place that functions in many respects like a dysfunctional Fortune 500 company with all the bizarre, quirky stuff that goes along with that, was pretty surprising to me. And I think continues to be, if not surprising, then just kind of very humorous. So that was probably the biggest aha for me that occurred over the first, few months I was there.
Mm-hmm. And you pulled in, like you said, so many of those details into the stories, like the clocks never quite matching and showing the accurate time. And again,
Yeah.
this big bureaucracy, and yet there's still the little things that they just can't get right.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I remember being inside and kind of wondering, like, why are the clocks always a little bit screwed up? And there's just sort of countless stories. There was a functional kind of trailer that got set up on site when we were staffing up the Iraq teams during kind of the height of the insurgency and the surge, in 2006, 2007. And there was a rat infestation in that trailer. So you'd be in really important meetings about serious topics, and then you'd hear something running through the walls or underneath the floor or the ceiling. One sort of fan favorite that I always enjoy talking about because it's so bizarre is that there was like a hot dog machine at Langley that I incorporated into Damascus Station, and I've never seen one anywhere else, but in the basement at Langley there was this Hormel hot dog machine.
People would actually eat out of it.
Oh yeah, I mean, I've consumed a highly classified number of hot dogs over the course of my life out of that machine, because the cafeteria at Langley closes typically at around like 2 p.m. And so if you have if you have to stay late and you didn't plan ahead, which happens with some frequency, you're kind of eating out of vending machines or, the hot dog machine if you want to eat dinner. So, I've been down there a number of times, much to my shame and disgrace. And, it's stuff like that like there's a thicket of agency regulations that sort of govern life at, on campus and at CIA. And I've kind of worked, fictional versions of that into the novel. So that piece of it, I don't know, I find, maybe it's just me, the analyst in me, but I find that stuff to be so humorous and so absent from most spy fiction that I've tried to incorporate it into my stories.
Okay, now one of the questions, and I may be bordering on political, so I'll apologize a little bit for that. But you always hear that in these elements that the rank and file are in the day-to-day, it's very apolitical.
Mhm.
But when you were in the CIA, because you left under Brennan, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Right.
He was the director when I left.
So you had Brennan, you had Petraeus, Panetta. I mean, you
Yeah.
had others. Did you notice a shift when the heads would change with the different political heads?
No, I didn't. And I mean, look, I think I'll say a couple things on this. One is the CIA, there's only two positions at the CIA that are political appointees, the director and the deputy director. So, in comparison to a lot of other executive branch agencies, the CIA is much more of a sort of professional, bureaucratic organization that is more consistent than not between presidential administrations or parties. So, and also, it's a big place. So even toward the tail end of my time there with Brennan, I probably wouldn't have been in a position, a managerial position high enough or anything like that to really see if there were substantial changes between, him and Petraeus or Panetta or, Hayden or anybody else. So that'd be one point I would make. I mean, I do think that one thing I always try to communicate whenever I talk about the CIA is that, really in contrast to a lot of the political narratives you'll hear today, I mean, the CIA is really truly, everyone has their own opinion there, obviously, about politics, but it really is an apolitical organization that for the most part is just really trying to get the best information possible to the president. And of course, there's warts and mistakes and all that kind of stuff, but I always found the place to be political conversation was refreshingly absent at all levels of the organization that I worked at, because everyone understood that it didn't really matter who the president was, which party was in power, we were doing the same job. So I don't know, that was my experience with it. Others who've served in different places and times and roles might have a different perspective, but that was always what I saw.
Mm-hmm. So even in gathering the information for the different areas, so like when you were focused on Syria, the changing political landscape, not only with the US not being as much of a factor, but more so what was really happening on the ground there. Because again, this was around the beginnings of the Arab Spring, right?
Yeah, no, yeah. That's exactly right. Yeah, exactly right. And that was a really challenging, a really stimulating period of time in some respects, but also a really tragic one in others to kind of watch the downward trajectory of that country kind of go from relatively, still flawed, but this authoritarian state that was relatively stable, into one that was decidedly not, and the immense amount of human suffering that's sort of been unleashed as a result of that. But I had I was there kind of, I lived in Damascus in 2010, 2011, and I really ended up having kind of a front row seat for a lot of it, for good or for ill. And I think that each administration, kind of more to the point of your question, each administration does bring a different or, slightly different political agenda to some of these problems. But the CIA is sort of, this is another important point about the national security system, is the CIA is not making foreign policy, deciding what we should be doing, in Syria or in Iraq or in Russia or with Iran or China. The CIA is really providing intelligence to the president on what's going on, why it matters, or what's going on, why it's happening, and why it matters for the United States. Really not recommending that we do this or that. So a president could come in and have a totally different perspective on a topic like Syria, and we're still obliged to, answer questions, provide that objective analysis. And I'll tell you, in both the Bush and Obama administrations, they got angry at CIA for at different times for providing that analysis in an objective way, because it sort of contrasts or makes the policy more difficult. So we're sort of an equal opportunity offender, I think, no matter what, whether it's a Democrat or Republican in office.
Now, when you left the CIA, you went into consulting,
Mm-hmm.
and so that you obviously had a break there before you started writing these novels. But what was that transition like from when you were an analyst in the CIA, where I'm assuming most of what you were writing were a lot of concise briefs and usually trying to boil down subjects, very complex subjects, into basically a page and a half, right? To convince and provide all the material for the decision makers to determine what course of action they need to take. So very crisp, clean, concise. Page and a half might even be too long, to now writing extensively long novels where we're scrolling through for every little detail. Those are two very different styles of writing.
Very different. Yeah. And like you said, I had spent really all of my time, you could probably argue that writing, academic stuff as an undergrad or in grad school also it's highly analytic. It's fairly anodyne. When you're talking about the CIA writing, there's a sort of bureaucratic process to it. There's a very specific structure. You're right, about a page and a half is probably too long for a lot of memos for the president's daily brief. It's more like a page or 3/4 of a page. And it's kind of the same with the consulting firm. I was at McKinsey and Company. It's a lot of PowerPoint slides. The room on those is fairly, you don't have a ton of space to work with, so you got to be pretty crisp and to the point with your language. And there are some lessons here, I think, that I've taken into my fiction writing. One of them would be precision of language. I think is still important in fiction. There's a way to do that without it being mechanical or devoid of voice, but being precise with your words is something that I think is really important. And then also being economical. How can I communicate this piece of dialogue in the character's voice, but also using the fewest words possible? So there are some things that carry over, but you're right that the writing for the agency in particular, there's no voice to it. It's a CIA product. Your name's not on it. And you're trying to really take out the individuality, any kind of sense of perspective or voice from that type of writing. So I really found writing fiction to be a freeing exercise from those constraints. I started writing the book that became Damascus Station in the summer after I left the CIA. And it was really a process, I think, of discovering or really trying to deal with the emotions that I felt after having worked on that topic and having lived there and watching the place devolve into civil war. And, this is a country that is just totally ripped to pieces and shattered, and so writing helped me to kind of work through what I felt about how I felt about that. And I think to recover some sense of the humanity and the inhumanity in a conflict like that I couldn't really, because you're not writing from the standpoint of really individuals or at the individual human level when you're writing stuff for CIA. It's at this kind of strategic upper level. So writing the novel or starting to write creatively really helped me, I think, to try to put humans and individual people back kind of front and center, in the story of Syria. So I found that I could sit down and write for 6, 7, 8 hours and time would fly by. And, it was more at times when I'm writing, it feels sort of frightening because you're encountering the blank page and you could say anything. And I've generally found that to be more freeing than terrifying. And so I think it sort of helped me to break out of some of that, those constraints that I had been writing under for most of my life, and write in a new way.
So if you started the book in 2011 when you first left the CIA, well, it was published several years after that. So were you continuing to write on it during that time? Did you put it aside? And if you did put it aside, what brought you back to it?
Yeah, I put it aside. So I left the CIA in 2014. I wrote about 100,000 words or so in between maybe May of 2014 and September of 2014. And it was not a novel. I think, it was from the standpoint of a story, plot, or even character, it was awful. It was more of a journal, some Frankenstein of kind of journal entries and musings and random character sketches and plot notes. But, I had found kind of that magic of, I love doing this. And, I had an opportunity. I took the consulting job. You fast forward 5 years, I'm working 70, 80 hours a week and traveling all the time and not sleeping much. So the side hustle of trying to write or even carving out, 30 minutes a day to do it was pretty much impossible. So it literally just sat. And then I took a leave of absence from the consulting job, was just kind of burned out and needed a break. And I pulled that manuscript out and also, sort of promptly realized it was awful, but understood that, I wanted to try to see if I could write something that I would want on my nightstand and that someone else might want to read. And so that leave of absence, which stretched about 7 months, was really when Damascus Station was written, and the book came out of that. It was sort of, I had enough space and time away from CIA and Syria, I think, to maybe be more objective about it, and more maybe professional as a writer about it. And it just took off from there. I wrote the book and haven't looked back.
I remember you mentioning at dinner that you had to send it to the CIA for them to review it before final publishing. With that in mind, for that book, and then also for Moscow X, did you find yourself doing your own self-censoring as you were writing, or did you just initially put it all out on the page?
I think when I start to draft, I put it all out on the page and I don't worry about that. I don't really edit for the first couple drafts of the book. I just kind of try to, or at least for the first draft, I just try to get it all down on paper, and I kind of don't care about, I don't care about basic writing mistakes, really. I don't care about revealing too much. I just put it all down on paper. And as the editorial process sort of goes from there, I do take a look at things pretty seriously and say, is this on the line, over the line? Should I or shouldn't I? And, I do self-edit. But that publication review process, is something I'll face for the rest of my life. I always send my books into the CIA to have them look them over. And I think, honestly, I source them, a couple hundred sources each to kind of point out where I got things in the open source world. So I haven't had too many problems. I've also, I know that the Publication Review Board applies a different standard to fiction and nonfiction. So, if I had tried to write a memoir about my time working on Syria, that would have been really challenging. But writing Damascus Station, as sort of weird as that is, writing Damascus Station, even putting a lot of real stuff in there, they didn't take it out. So, it's a bit of an arbitrary process, but I've mostly figured out how to manage it. And the Publication Review Board is pretty effective and professional about it. So that's been a positive too.
How about when you have real world scenarios that are now entering into your writing? I know when I was reading Damascus Station, everything that was going on in the Middle East, it's like, okay, it was hitting differently than it might have at another time. And of course, now with Moscow X, just the timing of it, I have to imagine that the war with Ukraine had to have played a factor in this.
Yeah, that it was in some respects the timing was very unfortunate, because I literally finished the first draft of Moscow X in early February of 2022, so just weeks before Putin actually invaded. And, I realized, and I kind of knew then, because I think it was starting to become clear even in like December and early January that the Russians were going to invade. I sort of knew that I was going to have to rework the novel to incorporate that, which was not fun. I was kind of ready to just move forward without it. And I had some plot things in
Like,
there that
surprise.
no longer made any sense. And it just, there was no other way around it. I had to rework scenes in Moscow and St. Petersburg to reflect the fact that the invasion had happened. I had to kind of think about every chapter scene in which I was in the head of one of the Russian characters. Does the changing reality inside the country, is that going to affect the way they're thinking about this scene? So it was a lot of work, even though the book's not about the war in Ukraine at all. It just sort of is out there hanging over the narrative or around the narrative. So that definitely, was a factor. And then, in this past summer in June, when Yevgeny Prigozhin launched his sort of abortive mutiny or, attempted coup, whatever you want to call it, I sort of found myself in the strange position of like, I saw the news, I was like, oh, I'm kind of, my knee-jerk reaction was like to root for Putin so that I wouldn't have to change the book again. If he got deposed, that quickly went away. So it was a different, Damascus Station, the Syrian civil war is still going on, but the events of that novel are taking place in the early years of it. So I never had to really worry about what was happening in Syria. And I was really watching a lot of the news on Russia and Ukraine pretty consistently while writing this book to make sure that, I was at least doing, doing it justice, right, in my novel.
Are you finding that a lot of readers are coming into Moscow X with different assumptions because we've historically had so many spy novels where Moscow has been kind of the opposing factor? And I'm saying that in comparison to the Damascus Station, where perhaps not as many people are familiar with the Arab world and the goings on there.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. There's a long, rich history of, sort of either, the Brits or us versus the Russian spy novels. That was almost every spy novel with very few exceptions for a lot of the Cold War, and it continues to be the case today. And I think that there's probably just more familiarity as American readers in general with Russia and with the idea of Russia being, this sort of antagonist or opposing force in a spy novel. I think, in Syria, the dynamic was different. And not only it was this relatively, sort of unexplored conflict from the standpoint of spy fiction, but it was also in a civil war where, I'd probably argue that in Damascus Station, it's not really the CIA versus the Syrians. It's kind of everyone against themselves or each other, so it's a bit more of that civil war dynamic. So it's a little bit different on both fronts.
And the other thing in both novels that got me, especially when you were mentioning Putin in each one, I'm like, okay, Putin, we're dealing with the real life people on all of these things, right? As opposed to other novelists, sometimes like Silva, where usually they're writing in such big characterizations. So people obviously know who the author means, but they're never outright named. So is that something that you were trying to take into account with your novels? And are there other characters that you're like, oh, I don't want to bring them in, but it's okay to mention Putin because of who he is and just the nature of things?
Yeah, I'll be honest, I've never understood why authors so clearly indicate who the character is and then don't just go and make them the character. I don't know. I kind of don't get that, especially when we're talking about heads of state that are immediately apparent. We know almost nobody would know who the director of the Russian FSB is, but everybody knows who Vladimir Putin is. And so if I call him, Vladimir Vladimirovich, like everyone knows, we all know. So why don't I just include my thought process was kind of just, let's just include these guys, both Assad and Putin, as characters. And also, I had a bit of a, especially with Assad, a bit of a selfish desire, because in Damascus Station, he's almost blown up. And, I don't really like Bashar al-Assad all that much because he's terrible. And so I was excited to give the fictional version of him, a real scare. So I had some selfish desires at play there.
Well, I also want to bring up the women in your novels because they're all very strong characters, um, fully realized and they're not just the damsels in distress like you sometimes see in certain novels. So from Damascus Station, Miriam, but now also with Moscow X with Sia and Anna, where they're going back and forth and kind of in this cat and mouse game of trying to recruit each other on things. But I've got to mention my favorite, Artemis Proctor. I mean, my gosh.
I was hoping you would say that. She's my favorite too.
I mean, the first couple pages in Moscow X, I mean, she has knocked out the Russian agent, stabbed him with a vodka bottle, knocked him out with a bottle of horse's milk, which apparently she would normally drink under more celebratory experiences, stolen his pants, gotten her compromising photos, which she kind of is like rather blasé about, and stole his pants. And now in Moscow, she has a baseball bat because people were complaining about the gun that she used to keep in Syria. I mean, and this is like the first few pages.
Yeah. Yeah. It kind of gets out of the gate with a little bit of a bang.
Just a bit. Inspiration.
I love her character. She is one of those characters that just kind of immediately, I don't know how she came about, in part because she just sort of walked into a scene one day in Damascus Station and kind of stole the show. And as a writer, you're always looking for that character. You're hoping you find that character, because not only is she extremely colorful and very deranged, obviously, but she has so much energy to her that she just makes things happen. And the book, I actually never had intended to put her in this book, and there was a period in the writing process where I felt like I needed to inject some energy and life into it, and so I just sort of brought, she was my favorite character in Damascus Station, and I just brought her into the narrative, and before you know it, she's stabbing people with vodka bottles and smashing bottles of horse milk over their heads, and we're off to the races. So she's a great character. I really love her, and she's also the star of the show in the third book, which will be out next fall.
Oh, fantastic. I'm so happy to hear that, because she is something else, let me tell you.
She is.
But with all of that, I mean, what is it that first inspires you? Is it the characters? Is it the storyline, the plot? And are you seeing that as a movie in your head, or what is that overall writing process?
Yeah, so my process is pretty inefficient. I don't have a better idea at this point. I just am doing the thing that seems to get books out, every year or two. I don't outline. I don't really have any idea what the plot will be when I start. If I can, I like to start with a pretty resonant image in my head. So with Damascus Station, it was a couple people in an interrogation room facing each other. In Moscow X, it was a woman riding on horseback away from a home that's on fire. And in both of those cases, I didn't have any idea who the people were or why they were in those situations, but I felt like I was seeing the emotional climax of the story, or like I had unearthed the part of the story that had a tremendous amount of energy. And so the writing process for me has been, how do I write to find that scene, to find that piece of the story? And typically I write, the books are somewhere between 100 and, let's call it 120, 130,000 words. And I typically write somewhere between 400,000 and 500,000 words to find the book. I don't know a better way to do it. I kind of equate it to, like, if you're putting together an album, a music album, got maybe 12, 14 songs on there. You probably wrote 30, to figure out what were going to be the top 12. And then those 12 were edited incessantly to make them as, pop as much as they can. And, I think my writing process is kind of similar, where I'll just sit down and the third book, like I just kind of sat down and I had no sense of the chronology or the plot even. I just wrote scenes that I felt like had energy, and then I went back and started to put them together into the story. And I don't know a better way to do it. It's if anyone here knows one, I would definitely love to hear it, because writing 400,000 words and throwing away nearly 300,000 of them is not an ideal process, but it's the one I've found so far.
Can you give us any hints as to the basis for the third book?
Yeah, so the third book is it's kind of a modern homage to Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, the great John le Carré novel, which I think is probably one of, if not the best spy novel ever written. And it's a mole hunt. It's a modern mole hunt with a Russian asset who is working inside Langley, and Artemis Proctor is brought back from her sort of debauched retirement to solve this mystery. And it'll be, I think, we don't have a specific date yet, but it'll be out sometime next fall, probably September, October, November, something like that.
Fantastic. Well, I will get in trouble with our readers if I don't throw some of our fresh fiction facts at you. So I know we're a little bit over, but these are meant to be some quick, off the top of your head type answers. Nothing to stump you. And I promise nothing too political in nature or delving into the history with the CIA. Okay.
I can take it. All right, hit me.
Who would you most want to be stuck in an elevator with? And
An
I stumped you on the first
an
one.
elevator technician.
That's a good one. Okay. What is something that you own a ridiculous amount of?
Books.
What is something other than books that you own a ridiculous amount of? Everyone answers books.
I know it is. It's one of my primary vices. I own a ton of. I'm a huge baseball fan, so I own a ton of like small collectible baseball helmets.
About those Rangers, huh?
Yeah, I know. It was a hell of a year.
What legitimately bad movie do you regularly enjoy watching?
Step Brothers.
Oh my gosh, that is a bad one. Yes. Okay.
I watch it every year. I without fail.
What is your most dog-eared or reread book?
It's Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, easily.
Read it once a year, and do you read the entire thing, or do you just pick it up at certain sections?
No, I would say I probably reread it once every 1 to 2 years, but this past year, because I was sort of basing the new book or trying to sort of redo the mole hunt, but give some tip of the hat to Le Carré. I think I reread it 3 times this year. So, but I've probably read it, I don't know, 20 times, something like that, 15 to 20 times. It's fantastic.
Okay, you've been kidnapped, but they return you after 3 hours because you will not stop talking about what?
Well, it's probably Cleveland baseball. I rooted for the Rangers in the playoffs, but my dad grew up outside of Cleveland and raised me on Cleveland sports, and so we are big. I guess they're now called the Guardians, but I still can't really accept that. Cleveland Baseball Club. We're big Cleveland Baseball Club fans. So that would be they'd probably shoot me. They might not return me. It'd be too much talk about Cleveland baseball.
So that's the team of your heart, even though you're in Dallas.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
Okay, we can go with that. What is your favorite road trip snack that you grab from the gas station?
Beef jerky.
What talent do you wish that you were born with?
A sense of tone when I sing.
So with that, do you listen to a playlist when you write?
I typically will listen to this either the same song on repeat, so it becomes white noise, and that can vary a lot over the course of the writing process, or something that I've consistently kind of incorporated into my writing has been there's a pianist named Ludovico Einaudi who gave a concert at I think at the Royal Albert Concert Hall in London, and that I'll listen to that kind of on repeat for extended periods of writing.
Mhm. What is your favorite writing fuel?
Coffee, lots of it, like ungodly amounts of it when I'm really working on a book. Yeah, like 6 or 7 cups a day.
What is your favorite genre to read?
I mean, it's spy fiction. Yeah. I mean, I in part, I mean, I was at the CIA, but in part I write it because that's what I grew up on and that's what I love. So that's where I will always, I make an intentional choice to read outside of the genre and really do enjoy reading outside of it, but I will gravitate toward spy fiction if given the chance.
Do you find okay, I'm kind of getting off the fresh fiction facts, but do you find that ever I don't know if it's confusing or that things start to overlap because you're reading so much spy fiction? And also, I've seen some of your other interviews and you're going on with other authors who are in the spy realm also. Like I saw your interview with John Carr, I think it was.
Yeah.
How does all of that kind of intermix sometimes as you're writing your own novels?
Well, I don't find it to be confusing. I find it to be helpful. And I think in large part because I see, I kind of think of the genre as like a long, ongoing conversation between a lot of different writers and readers over time. And so I think that it's just kind of like we're talking to each other. And so I think for me, it's helpful to really know what other people are talking about and writing about to help me understand even better what I want to do, and I think, it's probably true that there's really nothing new under the sun. And so sometimes just reading in the genre extensively gives me a ton of inspiration and ideas for my own work. So I find it to be really a source of inspiration more than anything. I think that the downside of it is you're always analyzing things now to figure out how did someone do this? If I like this, why do I like this? If I don't like this, why is that? So, I will say that kind of practicing the craft has probably in some, not all the time, but in sort of aggregate, probably reduced my enjoyment of reading because I'm constantly thinking about the craft.
Mm-hmm. With that, what is something that can immediately take you out of a story, be it either a book or a movie?
I think I think an excessive focus on like proper names or brands will do that because I think it makes me feel and it can be done well, but it makes me feel that kind of authorial intrusion at a point in the story where I shouldn't. And it makes me feel like it's not the character saying that, it's the author. So that'll do it for me.
What is the best book that you've read recently? And you can't say Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy.
I won't say that. I'm a relative latecomer to this, but there's a book called 5 Decembers by James Kestrel, which I think won the Edgar for best novel last year, if I'm not mistaken. And it's this really beautiful story about sort of a murder mystery that moves between, I mean, the murder mystery is kind of the spine, but it's also a love story, and it takes place during World War II, and it moves between Oahu to Hong Kong to Tokyo. And I really found it to be, it's extremely well written, extremely evocative of those places, and really heartfelt. Like it's a very moving story. That was probably the best novel I've read recently.
Okay, you're putting together the Mount Rushmore of authors. Who needs to go up on there? Either your favorites or the most deserving or influential.
Do I have to list out the names?
Yeah, well, the names or the books. I'll let you do either one.
Oh man. How many heads are on Mount Rushmore? Are there 4? Oh gosh. That's like, I mean, this is almost an impossible question. I mean, that's crazy. Let's see.
Is this the stumper?
I mean, this is like an almost impossible question. Let's see. I mean, I feel like you have to put Shakespeare up there. I feel like you need to put.
I mean, these could be the ones most influential for you.
Okay, all right, that's easier.
Okay.
Most influential for me. Let's see. Well, so it would be. I mean, it's going to be kind of a weird list. John le Carré, Jason Matthews, who wrote Red Sparrow. I think those books really kind of show that he and I are sort of, we're very simpatico, I think, in what we're trying to do. I would say Charles McCary, who was former CA. He writes spy novels, but he also just writes wonderful love stories and cares deeply at a human level for his characters. And again, it's going to be kind of a random one, but the only time I've cried while I've been reading a book is I read a book called Gates of Fire by Stephen Pressfield. And I would put him up there just because it's very hard to make me cry. And that's the only time I've cried while I've been reading a book. So I'll put him up there because that's an impressive feat.
Okay. All right, this one's going to be a fairly easy one, maybe, but probably not one you typically get. If you could see one and know that it's real, would you rather see a ghost or an alien?
Oh, definitely an alien. Definitely an alien. I think seeing a ghost would raise much more uncomfortable questions even than seeing an alien to me. If I knew it was real. So I'd rather see the alien. Because I could already kind of believe that aliens are there, but then to see a ghost,
being former CIA, I mean, come on.
And I've already seen one too, so there's that. It has that advantage.
If you came with the warning label, what would it say?
Doesn't care about your feelings.
Oh, harsh.
I know, terrible. I know.
Golly. Well,
that's why you put the label on.
True. Very true. That's why I asked. Yes. But with that, our final and most important question is, what is the best way for our readers to keep up with you and find out what's coming next?
Let's see. You can go to my website, davidmccloskeybooks.com. But I would say the best thing is actually probably to follow me on social media. The handle is @McCloskey Books, and you can find me on Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter. And I usually keep those pretty up to date. I've been doing more videos recently across Instagram and TikTok too, about writing, about the CI, all that kind of stuff. So that's probably the most up-to-date place to follow me if you want to know what's going on with writing and the books and everything else.
Well, David, thanks so much for sticking around and answering all of my questions on the CIA and your writing process and having our readers find out a little bit more about Moscow X.
Thank you for having me. It's been a ton of fun. I really appreciate it.